So, after all these years, Red vs. Blue is finally over. And it kind of feels weird to say that. Because to me, Red vs. Blue is kind of a show where you could almost stop watching at each quote saga and it feels like you have a bit of a full story. But this seems to be the definitive end, at least in terms of how Burns wanted to make the show. Hi, by the way, I'm Mike the Warrior. This video isn't really scripted, but I'm gonna try to make it as less rambly as I possibly can so I can get my thoughts out. I'm gonna have some timestamps in post for the people who just want to hear me talk about certain things. So I guess for starters, here's a little history about my relationship with Red vs. Blue. I first got into the show in middle school because I saw a bunch of clips that people were making through a bunch of memes and stuff that I had saw back then, and eventually I found out it was from something called Red vs. Blue, a web series based off of Halo. And eventually me and my brother decided to finally sit down and start it. We watched, the first episode, and those first few seasons I thought were really funny. I thought all the characters were, quirky in their own way. And it wasn't until the Freelancer saga where I finally realized that, hold on, this started as like a little jokety, but we actually got some really great storytelling in here. And that is a massive understatement, but a bit more in that later. So I watched all of the Freelancer stuff, and then we went into the Chorus trilogy, because when Freelancer ended, I was in the mindset of like, well, where do you go from here? It feels like we truly reached the peak of a journey. So I was really curious, but I was also excited to see what would happen after that. And then we got to the Chorus trilogy. Now, the first two parts of the Chorus trilogy I really liked. Temple was all right. And once Temple ended, before that, again, it looks like they killed Church again. But then we go into Temple, and after Temple's season, it just kind of got a little weird after that. And I had dropped Red vs. Blue, not because I didn't think it was good anymore, but Rooster Teeth wasn't uploading the episodes on YouTube as much, or at least as much as I was looking. And if I wanted to watch the episodes, I would have to go to their website. And as the years went on, at that point I was in college and I was focusing on other things. So like Ruby at the time, I just wasn't interested to go out of my way to look at Red vs. Blue as much because I had other things going on at the time. Eventually, I hear through the grapevines that there was something called Red vs. Blue Zero, and a bunch of my friends that were still into Red vs. Blue told me some things, and I don't think I'll ever sit down to watch Red vs. Blue Zero myself. It doesn't sound like anything I'd be too into, but some time passed and I heard that Red vs. Blue is ending, and I watched the trailer and I thought it was interesting that they were going to bring back Church again, and the original writer was coming back to wrap up the show in the way he saw fit. But some of you may not know that Rooster Teeth is officially shut down. And when that announcement came, everyone on Twitter, I remember I was at work, was freaking out for a multitude of reasons. What happens to the people working at Rooster Teeth? And what happens to Ruby? And I had the immediate reaction, does this mean Red vs. Blue's final season is canceled? And while they didn't cancel it, they decided to turn it into a film instead. And now we're here. So what did I think of Restoration? Overall, I like it. I think this was a perfect way to wrap up the show. It's not perfect by any means. If some people are watching this, they'll probably think that they were rushing through certain points of the story, and that's probably because they were. Like I said earlier, they had announced this as a series, then Warner Brothers decided to shut down Rooster Teeth, but luckily we're still able to get this, as a film, so I'm not surprised if they were trying to just push this out as fast as they could with what little time they had left. This is the non-spoiler portion, by the way. We have a bit of a smaller cast than what you were expecting. Some people's favorite characters might not show up, but I think it's for the best that the cast was as small as it was, because if this is going to be the ending, I think it's best that they stuck with the characters that they did, instead of just throwing at us like, here's all the characters who showed up in every single episode. In terms of the quality of the story, I think it probably is as best you'll get in terms of maybe like the quality of Blood Gulch or like the peaks of the Chorus trilogy. It's not up there with the Freelancers stuff, even with Burns here. Again, I do think that's probably because they had to find a way to make everything work with the limited time that they had. And we could also go into the animations. I thought the fights were fine for what they were. They're not awful by any means, but Monty is no longer with us, so I didn't expect them to be on the quality of the Freelancer saga anyway. Basis of the story is after the final battle in Chorus, chorus, or at least during the final battle in chorus, Church is running all these simulations on what will happen afterwards, right before he sacrifices himself, because he wants them to be ready for whatever happens. Anyway, Church comes into contact with the Reds and Caboose, because somehow the meta is returned. I say somehow, but it is explained in the film. And the Reds and Blues have to work together to take down the meta one final time, and that's basically it. Based off of the announcement trailer, as well as the trailer that told everyone that it's a film, we were able to deduce two things. The first one was that a lot of what we saw after chorus probably wasn't going to be canon, as it was straight up told to us that a lot of these were simulations. There was also a jab at Red vs. Blue Zero because no one liked it. And then in the second trailer, we were told that, okay, this is what the story is going to be about. The meta's back. And I thought it was kind of self-explanatory that, well, clearly it's not the actual main, because we were told multiple times that he's dead. And if you remember anything about chorus, who was wearing the armor right before the final battle? Tucker. So, okay, Tucker's the meta. And that's kind of everything I'm going to say in terms of the plot without going into full spoilers. This post on Twitter for anyone curious on how much exactly is canon and what isn't canon, because they do leave some details up to the imagination, which I think was kind of for the best. But with that, like I said, this kind of is done with the spoiler-free portion, as I'm going to talk about the story in a bit more detail now. I like it. To me, this is a almost perfect ending to the show, and I'll explain why in a bit. If you don't want to know these spoilers, feel free to click off the video right now. I'll give you guys a moment before I carry on. As I said, we had a bit of a smaller cast this time around, and I do think it was for the best. You know, keep the story with those who actually should be involved, rather than just throw a bunch of characters at the screen. Though there was a time and place where certain characters could have filled some spots, and I think it's a kind of a pro and a con in some scenarios as well. For example, I loved Sister as a character in the earlier seasons, and when I was no longer watching Red vs. Blue, apparently she came back for about 2 seasons while they were doing a bunch of time travel shenanigans. And Sister is the first Blue we see, I guess. However, this one opening scene is the only scene she gets in the entire film, which doesn't really make or break the whole thing for me, but it would have been nice to see more of her. And Donut is completely absent from the story. He gets one small cameo when Simmons is thinking about him in the final battle, so we don't really get to see his thoughts on certain scenarios at all. Though the big one that I see some of the other fans taking some issue with is how Wash was utilized. Now, one of the biggest retcons is Wash was shot during chorus, and in some of the later seasons that I didn't watch, apparently it was revealed he had brain damage, and this was a pretty big deal. And I recall in Red vs. Blue Zero, they got rid of that issue almost immediately, and fans didn't seem to like that. So Wash is in, I believe, a hospital, trying to get help from something, but it's not entirely revealed to us what it is. During his second scene, I was kind of figuring out what exactly was going on here, but it also seems to be the case on this is why Wash isn't going to be fighting, because there's something wrong with him, and he's not in the best position to be fighting the meta of all things. This is one of the complaints I've seen about the film. Wash is one of the best fighters in the story, as well as one of the best written characters, and it kind of writes him out of the story until he needs to call in Carolina for the finale. But how I took it, I'm aware Wash had brain damage, and because Red vs. Blue Zero kind of just immediately resolved his problem, a lot of people didn't like that. So I think this was their way of not doing the brain damage exactly, but still trying to give him something that he needs to be working on. During my absence of Rooster Teeth Media, apparently they've tried mental health at least 3 times in some of their stories, and presumably all 3 times they've fumbled the bag. But I think they did Wash's story pretty well, all things considered. It is a shame that it has to cost us Doc. We are in the spoiler portion, but Doc is revealed to be dead. He died trying to save Wash in the final battle on Chorus that we don't get to see. Now, we didn't get to see this battle originally, and while it is a bit of a giant hope that a lot of people wanted. I didn't think we would be seeing the final battle in Chorus, and if we did, the reveal probably wouldn't really work or hit nearly as hard at the revelation that Doc's been dead this whole time. And the Doc we see in the entirety of the film is just a version he made up in his head because he misses him. And it dawned on me while I was watching the credits roll that because of the relationship of these two characters when Wash was in his villain phase, it kind of hits a lot harder because, well, he hated Doc a lot in the beginning. But I do think it is a good send-off for Doc in a way because, well, he saved someone, something that he is criticized for quite often in the show because he's not that good of a medic in the eyes of the Reds and Blues. Now, when we move on to the things I actually really like, when it comes to the actual main characters of the film, I think they were all utilized kind of perfectly. And that might just have to do with the fact that, well, the story was just about them, specifically Sarge, Simmons, Griff, and Caboose, and kind of Church. They don't retcon Church's death at the end of Chorus. Instead, we have this little recording that's able to predict what they say, kind of like how Gamma did that to Church. Oh, before I forget, Caboose's original voice actor didn't return, but the new guy they have wasn't distracting enough where it took me out of the story. Speaking of, when I'll just call him Recording Church, I'll just call him Church. When he shows up to ask for the Reds' help, he predicts that the Reds won't help him at first, but they would eventually come around, and they do. And at first, I thought it was a little weird watching it, but thinking things over, because I did rewatch most of Red vs. Blue. I looked all the way from season 1 to, I think, season 10, when the Freelancer stuff ended. I didn't really feel the need to rewatch Chorus, because I remembered it pretty well. But the Reds are always the ones having to help the Blues with their problem, and Griff even calls them out during the Temple season about this. So it does make sense. But like Church predicted, the Reds did come around, and with this specific part of the story, I think the one who got the most interesting development to me was, well, Sarge, as he does end up dying in the midway portion trying to save Caboose from the meta. And Sarge dying was a possibility. I thought it was kind of up in the air if Sarge, of all people, would die, because he was always talking about how great of a soldier he was back in the day. And in terms of the Red team, he is clearly the best fighter they got. But just focusing on that one aspect, he doesn't go down swinging in a blaze of glory. He goes down protecting his enemy, the Blue, because, well, at the end of the day, the Reds and Blues kind of hate each other, or at least they pretend they do, but they do have each other's back, and I thought that was just a really good place for Sarge's character to end, as because of Sarge's death, it forces the other two Reds to have to step up. Simmons finally gets to be the leader that Sarge said he could have been, I think back in season 8, and he actually has a heart-to-heart with Griff about how rocky their relationship is, that he always pushes Griff and he's so hard on him because, well, he believes in him. And because Simmons and Griff are just good friends, I like that his first act as Sergeant is basically to discharge Griff, and now Griff can go home, but he decides that he'd rather stay and fight the meta. And it's good for both of their characters, because going home is legit all Griff wanted to do for the longest time. Back to what Caboose was doing, Church had basically told Caboose that he wanted him to grab a memory unit in an attempt to try to revive him one final time. Perhaps he wanted to try to fight the meta himself, who knows. And we have this really great scene with a campfire after Sarge's death, where Griff and Simmons go to check in on Caboose, and he basically tries to use their memories along with his memories to help with the memory unit. At first, they're a little hesitant just because they know how Caboose feels about Church, and it looks like he's in denial from their perspective, but they give in, and they just have this really great moment where they just reflect on everything they've been through. And when the meta is here, ready to fight them, Simmons and Griff decide to fight themselves while Caboose is finishing up. And we get this really great moment for Caboose, because instead of bringing back his best friend, he does something else that I actually think was one of the biggest brain plays I've seen anyone do in this show. But before that, Washington and what we now know was the fake doc, broke him out of the little hospital that he was in so he can attempt to help them, but he wasn't planning on fighting. Once he gets there, he basically injures himself so he can contact Carolina. And when this was happening, my first thought was, oh my gosh, what if Washington teams up with Church? We can finally get Epsilon and Wash like fighting together. That was like a random thought in my head, but I'm happy we didn't get that, even if it means Wash wasn't going to be fighting at all, because what happened was just a lot better. Because Caboose doesn't bring back Church, he brings back Tex. And my biggest want was, I would love if they could bring back Tex and give her and Church a happy ending. So when Tex shows up to fight the Meta, I was losing my shit. But it's not enough because Meta has all the AI fragments. And while Tex did do really well against Meta last time, he lost all of his AI. And now that he has practically all of them and he has the alien sword, because the Meta is Tucker, Tex is really outmatched this time around. So when Wash gets back up, we finally get Carolina and Tex having to work together. And at first, it still seems like it's not enough because Tex is programmed to lose because she's based off of Allison. But she then tells the Meta, or Sigma, as he clearly is the one running this show, when he starts to mock her, he talks about how they don't want her because, well, she's a shadow. She's a failure. She's programmed to fail. Then Tex corrects Sigma and says that no, that was the old Tex who was based off of the director's memories. And she's not based off of those memories anymore. She's based off of Caboose and the others' memories. And in their memory, she tells them that she always kicks their asses. And then we get this great comeback along with Simmons throwing the capture unit to Tex. And with that, Tex finally gets the run back against the Meta and, well, she wins. However, Tex is absorbed into the unit into the process, and while it's bittersweet, this was as close as we could get for a happy ending with her in Church. Like I said earlier, I just wanted them to get a happy ending somehow. And because all the AI fragments were in the unit, they reform the Alpha, and Tex this time talks to the Alpha AI version of Church, and instead of leaving him behind like she had to last time, she tells him that her name is Allison Church and his name is Leonard, and they're together finally. So now with the battle over, Tucker eventually wakes up, doesn't really remember what happened, and Washington and Carolina talk about what to do with the unit that's holding the AIs, and Caboose says that he already knows what to do because Tex told him, so he destroys it on the spot, and he'll never be able to see Church ever again. And this time, it's pretty obvious that it's for good, as this is the ending of Red vs. Blue, and you can tell that it clearly does hurt Caboose even before he blurts out that he's going to go somewhere to cry. And Carolina even tells Caboose that he did the right thing. This is also the scene where we're told that Doc has been dead all this time. We get this scene with all of the other freelancers to reveal that Washington's basically dealing with survivor's guilt amongst other things. And that's what's wrong with him, why he's in a mental hospital at the moment. And he asks Carolina if he's going to be okay. And I do feel bad for Wash, but I am happy that they were able to do his mental health story arc relatively well this time. And the ending of Red vs. Blue is Doc and Simmons finally saying goodbye to each other, as I said Doc and Simmons, my bad. Griff and Simmons finally saying goodbye to each other as Griff does leave like he always wanted. Now that the Meta's gone for good, he doesn't really have a reason to stay with them. And he says goodbye to Caboose as well, who seems to be doing better. And I also like the little nod that the pilot from the Freelancer flashbacks is actually one from Red vs. Blue Zero, showing that while things are clearly different, they're not just going to completely erase everything that happened. Some of those events still could happen, but it's just going to be slightly different, maybe a lot different, but none of that really matters at the end of the day. This is the definitive ending of Red vs. Blue for a large portion of fans, myself included. Though, as I said earlier, Red vs. Blue to me is a series where you could kind of pick which ending you want. Once we reach the conclusion to certain sagas in the Red vs. Blue story. Tucker is the last person to speak, as he says, and I quote, "What are you still doing here? Red vs. Blue is over. Bow chicka bye bye." And I thought it was somewhat fitting, as he doesn't really get to say much because he's being mind controlled by the meta. And I think Tucker arguably changed the most out of everyone over the course of the Red vs. Blue story. And my whole journey rewatching the show from the beginning leading up to this moment, I really just sat there looking at the credits, as it still hasn't really sunken in to me that Red vs. Blue is really over. That said, this doesn't mean I necessarily want them to just keep continuing the story till the end of time. To me, I am happy that Red vs. Blue is done, and the original creator was able to end it in his own terms. And I will be a little disappointed if someone later down the lines decides to just pick up the show and just keep going. I think this was just a really good conclusion for the main characters as a whole. Churches with Tex, Caboose got to use his brain and ultimately save the day because of it. Griff gets to go home. Simmons got the promotion he always wanted. Though, like I said earlier, the only one whose fate is kind of up in the air in terms of where they're going from here on is Washington. But I think it's for the best that they did do that, because I'd rather they leave it up in the air than just kind of rush through his recovery. As he didn't just do nothing. Yeah, he was basically a little plot device to get Carolina to the final battle. But I like that even though he knows that he shouldn't put himself in danger, he's still willing to do that to save his friends. I could go on and on, but I think I've said everything I need to say. It's been a really interesting journey with Red vs. Blue, but I am really happy that we got this film. To anyone who's watching, I would recommend the show if you haven't seen it yourself. And maybe if you see it through the lens that I do, I guess you could talk about which, quote, ending do you prefer. And for the people who have worked on this show, thank you for everything you've done. Without further ado, I'm Mike the Warrior, and I guess I'll see you guys next time.